This is a series that's jointly sponsored by the Education in Zion exhibit. Heather Severovich, back in the back, is our colleague, and Jane Birch and I from the Faculty Center have worked with her to establish this series that's been just a delight and very informative and inspiring. We started this several years ago as we were interviewing faculty members who were highly rated in their own disciplines as being both spiritually strengthening and intellectually enlarging. And then we'd ask them, well, you don't get born that way. How did you get there? And they had a hard time in the spur of the moment thinking about that. It had been a life's journey. And so we determined to give people several months to think about it and put them on the spot, but with time to think and actually reflect on a journey. And so that's the genesis of this effort. My intention now is to introduce Chris and then invite Matt Wickman, who is the director of the Humanities Center. He said also a schlep of a colleague of Chris's. Did I get it? I don't know if I had the second position down right, but one who with all of us admires Chris. I'll introduce Chris and then invite Matt to offer a word of prayer, and then we'll turn the time to Chris. Many of you have already seen the bio that we sent out to invite you, but Chris has had quite a remarkable career. It started before the bio. I just talked with Steve Smith, and Steve said he knew him as a football player here at BYU. It came as a non-member. Maybe this will be part of your journey. I don't know, Chris. I don't want to steal any thunder. But and you were on the weed whipping crew. He was the foreman of the crew. And so anyway, his connections here go way back. But he spent 10 years teaching high school English, and then went to a position in the English department in the Himeji Dokyo University in Japan, and spent 3 years there, and then was at BYU Hawaii for 4 years teaching English and directing the University Honors Program until he then in 1993 joined the faculty here. His department chair says he's one of the most trusted voices in the English department, a man who does not let ego get in the way of making good decisions, that is level-headed, that works thoughtfully, carefully as a colleague. He's teaching English education because of his English high school teaching experience, as well as his college sophistication and his young adult literature background. He's a unique and valued resource in the English department. He's currently the coordinator of the English teaching major. His wife Elizabeth is here with us, his high school sweetheart. They have 4 children and 8 grandchildren. His students say about him that he has high standards, but provides remarkable support and encouragement for them to meet those standards. He's someone who has been one of our highly rated faculty in terms of being both spiritually strengthening and intellectually enlarging. So it's my pleasure to introduce and invite Chris to come and share his journey with us. Chris?
So when I first heard about the enlarging part, I thought it was physically enlarging. I'm really good at, I've been fighting that part of my career for a long time. This is going to be a little bit informal. If you came expecting something brainy, you're not going to get that today. It's going to be more personal than academic. And to me, the title of this lecture series suggested that was the direction they go. And I'm defending my personal approach by citing Henry David Thoreau in Walden when he said, I should not talk so much about myself if there were anybody else whom I knew as well. So today I'm just going to talk about, if I turn my PowerPoint on, this journey I've been on for some 40-some years. I think this year is my 40th year as a teacher, which seems in some ways incredibly long. In other ways, I'm surprised to look back and think, oh, that's really gone fast. But for me, it started when I graduated from BYU with a degree in English and a certificate to teach secondary English in December of 1976. And there weren't many jobs mid-year then, and so there was some pressure. And so when we were evicted from Wymount Terrace, we had like 5 days, and I didn't have a job, and my wife and I had the anxiety of what's coming next. I mean, we did not know beforehand what was coming. I was interviewing all over the place, just hoping I could get a job, hoping that somebody got sick mid-year so I could replace them. You know, whatever the scenario was, I was desperate. And fortunately, through my experience, I've learned that just by relying on faith, we can walk, my wife and I, but in my career too, we've walked by faith, not by sight. Just by going forward and having trust in the Lord that things are going to work out. And that's kind of my theme. But I feel like a lot of my time, I've spent my career in the dark, and I haven't been strategic. It wasn't a grand master plan that I'm going to do this, then I'm going to do this. I felt like I was feeling my way through most of my career. Like Nephi, there was a glimmer of faith, a glimmer of light that helped me because I didn't know beforehand the things that I should do. And over the years, I've learned that good things happen eventually if I move forward in faith, even though sometimes it's incredibly scary. So when I was a young married guy, I saw through a glass darkly my future. And my goal, and this was my entire goal, was to be a high school English teacher, coach a couple of sports at a good school for the rest of my life. And we ended up getting a job at mid-year, so starting in January at Weber High School up in Ogden. We bought a tiny little 960 square foot house in Ogden, just on 29th Street below Harrison, if you know Ogden, and thought, this is it. We're settling down, this is putting down the roots, and this will be my career, our lives as a married couple. And that went okay, except when you replace a teacher who's been on medical leave, he'd had a series of substitute teachers. And every teacher who showed up for a week or two would say, well, I'm the permanent, I'm here to stay. And then they'd be gone. And so the students were used to running out whoever happened to show up. And so in January when I showed up, they were already well paced in, how do we get this guy to leave? So it was a little bit of a rocky experience, but it was a good job. And I figured out how to teach kids who didn't want to be taught. And the school seemed to be supportive in lots of ways. And we enjoyed our ward and felt like we were really on our own. I should say, add to this, that my dad was a guy who never settled down. So he and my mother moved more than 40 times before he died in 1999. My mom can't even remember all the places they've lived. And so I was a part of that too as we were moving. And all those years I was promising myself, I will never do that. I will never uproot my kids. I will never change jobs. I'm going to find the job and work it until I retire. So that was my vow. So, but there are some difficult decisions related to that, and here's sort of the path. So I got a job at Weber High School in January of 1977, and we expected this was it. And then in March or so of that same year, my brother, my oldest brother, who was teaching in the school district where we had gone to high school in Arizona, called and said, hey, our old school, McClintock, has an opening for an English teacher, and they're looking for a coach. You should apply. And I thought, yeah, I should apply. So I did, and that worked out. So I got a job back at my high school alma mater, which was an interesting experience, and I was counting on the fact that my teachers, who were then colleagues, wouldn't remember me when I was their student, because I was a little bit of a knucklehead sometimes. And this was a wonderful high school. So in the shadow of Arizona State, it made it easy to go to graduate school part-time while I was working full-time as a high school teacher. I quit coaching after a few years because it was just too much to do all that stuff and still do anything else. But we had great students. They had a great arts program, great sports program, wonderful teachers who were committed to the profession, supportive parents. It was the kind of place that really it would be easy to retire from there. But after my 7th year, I'd been going to school part-time, just taking my comprehensive exams, and so I just had my dissertation left. And we were about 2 weeks into school, and it was Friday afternoon. I still remember I was dinking around in the English department office. No one was around, and I didn't want to go home because I knew if I did, I'd probably have to do something, some kind of work. So the district newsletter had come out, and it said that a school in Himeji, Japan was looking for an English teacher to come out for that year. And I thought, I was kind of had the 7-year itch, and I called Elizabeth and said, what would you think about going to Japan this year? And she said, that might be fun. We knew nothing about Japan, 2 little kids then. So I called the guy in charge of it. He was the president of Phoenix College who coordinated the Sister City Exchange. And he said, hey, how fast can you get there? We need you right away. And I said, well, I don't even have a passport, but I'm happy to work on it. And I'm assuming the district will give me a leave of absence so I can come back. And he said, well, just one question, are you married? And I said, well, yeah, I am. And he said, oh, well, we don't have housing for a married couple, so I guess we can't use it. And I said, okay. And then Saturday, this guy called me back and he said, I talked to the Board of Education in Himeji, and they want you to come. They found a place where you and your wife can live, so how soon can you, the same question. And I said, I'll get there as fast as I can. He said, just one question, do you have any kids? And I said, yeah, we have 2 kids. And he said, well, we can't, there's no housing for kids. So then he called me on Sunday and said, how soon can you get here? We got housing for you. So 6 weeks, we packed up, found someone to rent our house. We were gone for the year. And it was an interesting cultural experience to be dropped into a foreign country where we literally knew nothing about the language and almost nothing about the culture. But it was also invigorating to be forced to be the other and to live in a way really alien to us and learn new things and learn a little bit of a language. So after that year, the end of the year, my boss, who worked for the mayor, came and asked if I was interested in staying another year. And I said, no, I've got to go back. I've taken my comps. I've got to write my dissertation. And he said, well, okay. And then a week or 2 later, he came back and asked, he said, the mayor wants me to to ask you a different question. We're working with a campus in Tokyo to bring a new campus from this university to Himeji. Are you interested? And I said, I don't know. Keep me in mind. I don't know what my future holds, but just keep me in mind. And so I went back to McClintock and thoroughly enjoyed being back with my students. And I think I was a much better teacher, too, having had some broadening experiences and a different view of education and how students interact with faculty and testing and all those kinds of things. And they're quite different in Japan than they were in the United States. So I settled in, finished graduate school, just figuring this is it. We're here. And my former boss called one day a couple of years later and said, where have you been? This is before email. He says, where have you been? My phone number had changed, and he didn't know how to get a hold of me. And he said, the Ministry of Education is approving the faculty for this new university, and we need to know if you're coming or not. It was a lifetime appointment, and we need to know in 3 days if you're coming. And by then, Elizabeth and I knew what we were getting into, and we had 4 kids by then, but it was in Himeji, near Kobe, and a beautiful place, but really cold in the winters, and you ride bikes everywhere, and nothing's heated, and the schools are freezing. Our daughter got frostbite from washing her hands constantly, and the elementary school had no heat. And other things were delightful, but it was hard. Also, church was hard. Our bishop spoke English, but no one else did. It was hard to feel connected to our neighbors, and we were weirdos, gaijin, the word for foreigners, and so we didn't want to go. And I was serving in the bishopric at the time, and I remember I went to the bishop and I said, hey, Bishop, you tell me what to do. If you want me to stay, I'll stay. If you tell me to go, I'll go. You tell me. And he just laughed. He said, you have to do the hard work. I'm not going to do it for you. And so we started praying and making the pro and con lists, and because we knew what was expected and what life would be like, and this would be a permanent kind of move. There was no lifeline. It was really scary. And at the time, I remember thinking, I feel like I'm either Jonah or Abraham. I want to make sure I'm the right one. I'm kind of hoping I'm Abraham, where Abraham's asked to do something difficult, but at the last minute said, you don't have to do it. But Jonah, who didn't want to do something, tried to run, got vomited up by a whale and had to do it anyway. So, but ultimately, even though it was counter to everything we wanted to do or had thought we would do, we felt prompted that we were supposed to go. So we sold most of our stuff. We had 4 kids, so we had 12 suitcases and 12 carry-ons, 12 suitcases and 6 carry-ons, tons of stuff. And our heirlooms, we asked neighbors or family to take care of, rented our house, and we figured we would be gone for a long time. And settled down in an apartment in Japan, which was an interesting deal just to figure that out. But after a couple of years there, we realized there's really not a future for us because we don't have the culture to drive our kids to study the way the Japanese do, so they can get into a decent high school and then into a decent university. There's no chance for them. And we couldn't afford an international school, so we started thinking, what are we going to do? And just even spiritually, we were very independent spiritually, but the ward, as kind as they were, it really was, we were on an island with them. And I served as financial clerk because I could read numbers and not make too many mistakes, but that's all I could do. We taught the nursery together. That was our language level in Japanese. So we started applying for jobs, and I found pretty quickly no one wants to, this is in the late 80s, no one interviews somebody in Japan because they don't want to bring you for an interview from across the other side of the world. And there's a long story here, but eventually I was offered a job at BYU Hawaii. Lanny Britch at the time was acting vice president and made the call which really changed our lives. And there was no decision there. We thought, are you kidding, Hawaii? The things that we love about Japan, Hawaii still has. It was really figuratively and literally midway between the United States and Japan. And we thought this will be a great opportunity for us. And so we moved there, settled in. It was a small campus. This is the university in Himeji, BYU Hawaii. And we thought this is really the last stop for us, and we're not going to go any farther. And after a year there, we bought graves because we knew this is our last, this will be literally our resting place. Our kids went to school barefooted and, T-shirts and jams, what they wore. It was really a great place. The campus was small and it was easy. There wasn't a lot of bureaucracy, so if I had an idea, my department chair would just say, sure, you can do that, and we'd figure out how to do it. And there were lots of opportunities there, and no reason, certainly, to ever leave that place. So after 3 years there, I got a letter from Greg Clark who said, we have an opening here in Provo. Are you interested in applying? And I thought, no, I don't want to apply. I'm not interested at all. I love living where I'm living. I love my colleagues and my students from 60 countries. In a student population of 2,000, we had 60 countries represented. And that richness was just too good to give up. But as Elizabeth and I talked, we thought, well, it doesn't hurt to apply because that's not a decision. The decision is if they offer you something, then you have to decide. And I thought, okay. And so I applied, and we did a phone interview, and then they said to come for a campus interview. You guys know how that goes. And I came thinking, I'm going to tell them what they can do with their stupid job. Because I don't want to work in Provo. I don't want to live in Utah. I never have wanted to live in Utah. And I feel like I know what I'm doing here. This is where the Lord wants me. And they ended up offering me a contract. And then we had this wrestle with the Lord where our faith was tried, because what do? Do we leave this place we love, where we feel like we're thriving, our family's thriving? It wasn't perfect, but we certainly were very content there, and go to another alien place where there are Utah Mormons and they have winters and all these kinds of things. We weren't sure we wanted to do that. So after lots of fasting and making of lists and weighing pros and cons and talking to people who taught here in Provo and talking to family members and trying to get the answer, we just had to pray and pray and pray and held the stupor of thought for the longest time. Until finally, Elizabeth said, well, maybe we just need to make the decision and then pray whether that's right or not, which of course is the right way you're supposed to do things. And so we thought one Saturday morning, we're in our bedroom and kneeling down, praying and talking, and finally said, okay, I'm not getting an answer here whether we should accept the job or not, so we're going to stay. That's our decision, we're going to stay. So we knelt down and prayed about that, and it was just like a slap in the head, like, that's the wrong answer, that's not it. And so by default, we realized, we've got to go to Utah. And I remember the first snowstorm. We had a house in Springville. I only had a square-nosed shovel. I didn't even have a snow shovel. I was out there trying to scrape ice, and our kids were, of course, confused. So we ended up here in Utah, and it's been okay. We tried to get to Hawaii. I had to promise Elizabeth we'd get to a beach at least once a year, and we try to go to Hawaii as often as we can, but it's not always easy to get there. But that, as a teacher, it wasn't exercising faith just in terms of where I worked, although that certainly is a big part of it. But even as a teacher, I learned lessons about working with students and working with colleagues and working with institutions that relied on, I had to have faith for certain things to work out. And Sometimes I had no idea if they would work out or if I should even be asking for these kinds of things. But they did work out in most cases, or if they always worked out, sometimes not the way I wanted. But there's that. So the second part is, I don't really know if I'm a scholar or not. I guess I feel like I'm someone who learns and likes to share learning. I've always felt like I'm a blue-collar academic, maybe, not a elite kind of academic, more a teacher and a writer than a scholar. But I have done the stuff that professors are supposed to do, have thought and written about literature especially, or teaching, and have thoroughly enjoyed that. So, and I believe in this promise, and for me it's an act of faith to rely on that promise in DNC, in the word of wisdom, that one of the blessings we can have is finding hidden things, new knowledge, which is what universities are supposed to be doing. So for me, it wasn't hard to write articles, and you do that for a while, and I figured that out. But I was looking as a new colleague here at BYU for an important book to do with a good press, something that would take more work than just an article. And praying about it, thinking about it, looking for opportunities, and I knew I wanted to work. Young adult literature is my academic specialty. That was easy. But what to do with that, I wasn't sure academically the way to go. And I was at a convention, and I was sitting at a table with about 8 people, and 2 of the people from Arizona State, one had been my dissertation committee chair, and his colleague. And we were talking, and a woman who is an editor of a series published by Twain, literary biographies, was there too, and they were talking about what they had done, and this friend from Arizona State said, Chris, you should propose a book for that series. And so the editor turned to me and said, yeah, why don't you? And I thought, well, I'm not sure how to write a proposal, but other than that, maybe I will. And it came down there to 2 subjects that were really, I felt, both very promising. One was an author named Bruce Brooks, who was very talented, but very gifted, intellectually gifted. His books were challenging and full of possibilities, and I thought I'd love to delve into his work and think and try to understand him and what he's trying to do. But the other author was one I knew less about, named Mildred Taylor. And I even knew Brooks, and of course I knew his work, and I didn't know Taylor and didn't know her work, but when it came down to thinking about who I should pursue, I just felt prompted that it should be Mildred Taylor. I didn't know why. So I wrote up the proposal. It was accepted. I did get to know her, especially got to know her work, though, and that led to this. And as an African-American writer, born in Mississippi but raised in Ohio, she was part of that migration north in the 40s. Studying her life and her writing led me to learn lots of things about American history that I just didn't know. And so it's as if Robert Frost was understanding this journey of faith, Frost said that way leads on to way. And in my scholarship, that's certainly been the case. And so this Taylor book introduced me to the story of a teenage kid from Chicago who was murdered in 1955. It really was a turning point in the American Civil Rights Movement, and there was nothing at the time published about him. And I thought, I'd like to write a historical novel capturing this moment, and because it's a teenage story, it's a story of a teenager, and a story that changed America. So Taylor just kind of offhandedly mentioned this kid. She didn't give his name, and I thought I'd better just track that down and learn about Emmett Till. Well, that led to a nonfiction book about the case, where using the research I'd done for the historical novel, I was able to respin and use illustrations from the photographic evidence from the case to do a nonfiction book. Then a year or so later, I was invited by Penguin to do a biography of Thurgood Marshall, who coincidentally was the legal mind behind the Civil Rights Movement, especially emerging around the time the Till case was big in 1955, and he went on to other pretty big deals. And Emmett's favorite baseball team had been the Chicago White Sox. And when I was interviewing his mom, asking her who was his favorite player, she said Minnie Minoso, I'd never heard of. But also when I was studying the team that year, the year that Emmett died, there was a big to-do because this guy named Larry Doby had signed a contract, been traded there. And I thought, who's Larry Doby and why is that a big deal? And well, Larry Doby was the first black player in the American League, just weeks after Jackie Robinson. And there's a famous photograph that in the World Series game when Doby hit a home run to help win the game, the pitcher is hugging him in the locker room after, and they're cheek to cheek, white to black, and it created a huge uproar because people just weren't ready for that. And so Dobie, like Robinson, really helped open, turn over Jim Crowe. So these were all things that were totally not strategic, totally stumbling forward in faith, thinking the Lord's going to give me something else to do, paying attention as I'm stumbling along the path of learning stuff to see, well, what else is going to show up as I keep digging. I'm going to end with, this is the real boring part, kind of my creative process on a recent work. So it's not my last book, I hope, but it's my most recent book. And it's one that I think that faith helped me solve the problem with this book. So when you write fiction, since it's all in my imagination, it's not like book ideas just drop in my mind, like they do with some people like Brandon Sanderson, but they don't for me. And so after I finished that book on Dobie, and I was working on another historical novel, but I wanted to do something else, and I heard this radio interview with this guy, Gene Cheek, who just published a memoir about his life. I think it was in North Carolina in the early 60s, and this is Gene there. And he had this horrible life, a horribly abusive father, and neglectful and mean, a cruel drunk who would beat Gene and his mom whenever he was around. And so Gene has captured this in this memoir that's really kind of poorly written, but his life is really sad to read. And so he's talking about this, and he said that one day he came home, he was probably 8 or 9, and his mom was on the phone, and she was crying. And he assumed it's Dad again, what's Dad done now? And Mom hangs up and hides the tears, and he doesn't, he doesn't notice things at 8 or 9. But after a few months, he realizes the abuse has gotten worse for Mom, and also Mom's belly's growing, and she must be pregnant. And then he realizes that's why his dad's mad, because Mom's pregnant. And he said some things that suggest that maybe that's not his child that she's carrying. And so, he's, as a kid, starting to understand that. But then when she was ready to deliver, her sister took her to the hospital because her husband wouldn't. And when the baby was delivered, it was a brown baby. And her sister was horrified that Gene's mother had not just committed adultery, but had committed adultery with an African American. This is the 60s, right, in North Carolina, and abandoned her there in the hospital. And of course, when her husband found out, when Gene's father found out, the abuse just erupts. I mean, it was nothing before this. And so it was pretty terrible. And after a few days passed, or a few weeks or months even, Gene's mom gets a call from a lawyer who says, we've got your husband cornered. We're going to force him to pay child support. Show up to court tomorrow morning, bring your sons. And so they show up thinking they're going to get help, but it's really an ambush. And so when they go to court, the judge gives her Sophie's choice, because as a white woman who had a black child, she's not fit to have a white child in her home. Neither is she fit to be a mother for anybody. And so the choice was this. You give up the black child into foster care, which would be like a death sentence in 61, or you give up your white son into foster care, which would be like a death sentence in 1961. And before she could answer, and this is the moving part for me, Gene stood up and told the judge, take me. Take me. And the judge said, fine, and gavelled it down, and that was the decision. And so Gene sent himself into foster care. And so for the next 10 years or so, it was a series of neglect and abuse, and he'd run away to visit his mother and brother, and he'd get beaten when they'd catch him and put him in a new foster home, and it was this horrible cycle. This kid's life was ruined. And I was so awed by him. I was thinking, I want to write a story where the kid has that kind of courage, where a child of 8 or 9 or 10 or 12 or 15 even has the courage, because he loves something else more than he loves himself, to give up his life. I wanted to write that story. Not Gene's story, but a story with that at its heart. So that got me researching miscegenation laws, and there's the famous case Loving versus Virginia, but other really weird cases like Kirby versus Kirby in Arizona, that was the Arizona Supreme Court, and the California Supreme Court, where these couples were denied the right of marriage based on race. Sometimes the rule was a clerk would just decide if they looked like they're the same or not, and would issue the license or not. It was that whimsical. So that was something I started digging into, and when I was thinking about this, we had a guy, actually he spoke in here, Gary Schmidt, we were talking about research and history, and he's a historical novelist, and he mentioned just offhand that 1968 was the worst year, by the way, for American soldiers in Vietnam, and I didn't know that. And so I made a note that sat for couple of years on my computer. 68, the worst, you know? And these things are in my mind, these themes. I'm searching for a story. I'm not finding one. I have faith that I might, but there's no confidence that I will. And still searching and starting to study 1968, which was crazy, a crazy year. I was alive in 1960, but I don't remember these things, not for the reasons most people don't remember 1968, but I knew about the big things. You know, I knew about the big things, but I didn't know the popular culture, which is a part of my life. Some I knew about Simon and Garfunkel. I didn't know it was the Beatles last year. This was sensational for us in ninth grade. This movie was way beyond my radar in 1968, but curiously, a movie about miscegenation. I didn't know anything really about the politics of what was happening in the 60s, and so learning more about the civil rights and what's going on, but the women's movement and the objectification of women and the peace movement and Nixon winning the election. These were things, Nixon I think was something I'd heard about, and I'd heard about civil rights, but really didn't know about it as a kid in the 60s. And then of course, the Democratic National Convention and how Mayor Daley sent his thugs out to crack the heads of these hippies. I mean, he told them, shoot to kill if you have to, shoot to maim. They shouldn't, and America, 60 or 70% of Americans thought that was a good idea, what he did. And of course, the Mexico City Olympics, these two guys who, after winning the 200 and taking third, the bronze, during the national anthem, and think about kneeling down now in the NFL, they lost their medals. They were kicked off the Olympic team. They only got their medals back 5 or 6 years ago. They were pariah for doing this, and all they did was just silently stand there with their shoes off and hand raised. So I didn't know that, and of course, this is the year we orbited the moon. We didn't land, but 68 was the first time we saw Earth from outer space. And so this is all kind of falling into my head, and I'm hoping and praying that it's going to add up to something, but it wasn't adding up to anything at the time. And behind all that stuff, of course, is Vietnam. It's like steady static. All these other things are going on. But Vietnam is relentlessly, the death count is just mounting every day. There are more who die every week. It just grows and grows, and it's overwhelming. The My Lai massacre took place in 68. It wasn't just Americans who were suffering. It was Vietnamese as well. And I was wondering about what Gary had told me. Was it really the worst? And when I started digging into the death toll, the fatalities in 1968, 16,592 American soldiers died that year. And it was more than all the years before. All the Vietnam War years added together didn't equal 16,000. So it really spiked, and it dropped after 68. So it was a bad, bad year. So I want to write a book. I've done my research. I've done my homework. And the words just aren't leaping off my fingertips. I do finally, knowing what Elder Bednar said, no, I have to get to work. And so this is the first page of my first draft. And so everything's in my head that I need to know about the culture, the milieu of the time. But what do I do with that? And even who's going to tell the story? Who's my character? And I choose to have it in Arizona, in the house I grew up in, and a place I knew. And the high school I attended, I thought that's familiar, distant, but familiar, and maybe I can bring to life these other aspects of 1968 somehow. But I was writing this several chapters in, and I was bored. The whole thing bored me. And that's really a bad sign as a writer. If you're bored, your mother will still like it, but if you're bored by your own writing, I knew this wasn't working. And it was really discouraging because this had been years. It wasn't just months. This had been years of researching and thinking and looking and trying to figure stuff out. So I really had a bad case of writer's block. And most people who write have had this from time or two, but this is something where I felt there was a lot of promise in this project, but I just couldn't conceptualize it in any kind of way that was making it move for me. So I was frustrated. It was on my mind all the time. And I was thinking about, okay, what have I done so far? My main character is 17 years old because he's draftable then. He's on the brink of the draft. I went Vietnam to loom for him. He was born on May 17th, which I like to just have coincidences, but May 17th was the day of the Brown versus Board of Education decision, so I thought there's a civil rights connection, even though he doesn't know that there is. His dad had played college football and wore the number 17, which I thought, okay, this is kind of a cool prime number thing I'm doing. I don't know why, but I couldn't think of anything else with 17. And as a writer, if you're starting to think about numbers, you're not going the right way because it's all about words. But there's a certain kind of cicada locust that's buried for 17 years and then emerges after 17 as as an adult. I thought, what a nice metaphor for adolescence. You know, you're a bug. And, but anyway, I couldn't think of anything. And I was thinking about the death toll too. You know, all these soldiers, these young men, sometimes very young men, who thought they were doing good things and sacrificed their lives for our country as patriots. So I wake up one morning, it's 4 o'clock, I'm staring at the ceiling, I'm desperate to try to solve this or just abandon it and go on to something else, and wondering when the faith is going to kick in and make something happen. I felt like I was exercising faith, but that wasn't getting the payoff there. And I was thinking, what else has 17 in it? And I'd been goofing around for a year or so with haiku, and I thought, you know, haiku have 17 syllables, 575. Huh, what could I do with that? And I knew that 68 was divisible by 17, and I thought, is 1968? So I had to get out of bed to get a calculator to do that, and it's not. If it had been, I don't know what I would have done, but I thought at least it would have been an answer to this problem. And then I was thinking about the death count, and I thought, is a death count divisible by 17? And it was exactly divisible, and I thought, so what? What am I going to do with that? It's kind of a cool coincidence, but what am I going to do with that? And I started thinking about haiku and formatting. I thought maybe the book could be in 17 sections, or maybe each section could have a haiku as kind of an epigraph to introduce the idea, the theme of that chapter, or maybe my main character could write haiku to his girlfriend, or I didn't know what was going to happen. But then I was thinking, well, what if I wrote the whole thing in haiku? And what if the book had exactly 16,592 syllables? What if it's 976 haiku? So there's one syllable for every soldier who died in 1968. Could I do that? And I thought, of course you can't do that. What a gimmick. What a dumb idea. That's ridiculous. And no one's going to want to do that. But I couldn't stop thinking about it. And so I wrote a few chapters and kind of liked them. And I sent them to my agent. I said, what do you think? What do you think of that? Do you think I could do that? And this is her response. And she said, probably, in essence, she said, probably you can do that. She found several places where I was way off on the syllable count. But essentially, you have to be able to count to 17 to do that. And I thought, okay, but if I can do that, do you think I can do that? And she said, well, what agents are supposed to say, well, write the whole thing and then we'll see. So I wrote the whole thing, and she found a publisher who was interested in it, and they really did a nice job with producing the book. Well, here's what I believe. This would not have happened if I hadn't had faith. I could not have solved this book. It was not going to work the way I thought it was going to work, the way I'd planned it would work, the way I had expected everything would fall into place after doing all the research. And it wasn't my first time to write something, but it just wasn't working. And I was dependent on the Spirit to unlock something, I didn't know what, but to unlock something so this book could come out. And I can testify to you that when you're doing something creative or scholarly, that the Lord, if you're working in faith and doing the things you should, the Lord will open doors to make those things happen, whether they're discoveries or inventions or just writing a nice poem. All those kinds of things require the Spirit. And the faith that we can exercise will guarantee that we'll have success in one form or another as we exercise faith. And this is a scripture that I believe in everything I do, in teaching, in my scholarship, in my writing. When I sit down to write, I always pray before I engage something, not just a big project, but every day when I sit down again to do that work. Because I believe that the Lord will consecrate my performance if I move forward in faith. And I know He'll consecrate your performance as well as you move forward in faith in whatever endeavors that you have. The Lord wants all of us to be successful, and He knows that we have those abilities, and He has the ability to gift us with His Spirit when we act in faith to be successful. And I leave that testimony with you in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. Thank you.
This is your opportunity to ask some questions.
Yes.
Did you ever feel in your scholarly journey that you weren't good enough of a writer to do this, to write novels, write books, and what did you do to combat that?
I still feel like that. It's not, I think what I've learned is what Elder Bednar said, you just have to get your feet wet. So for me, even if I don't feel like writing, and I do have lots of ways to divert myself. So the problem with writing historical fiction is there's always the excuse of learning one more thing, doing a little bit more research and never getting around to writing, because the research is fun for me, but the writing I don't like. The revision I like. I don't like the first draft. Because those voices, those critics are saying, no, this is stupid, no, you can't do this, why are you wasting your time? And first drafts are crummy anyway, so those voices are right. But we also know we have revision, and so I have to give myself permission to write poorly, and know that there will be time, if this is worth working on, there will be time for me to come back and improve it. And I have lots of colleagues, and my wife's a wonderful reader, who will tell me the truth, this isn't working, or this part's okay, but this part needs to be worked on more. And so it's nice having those trusted readers. I learned a long time ago that I have to have people who tell the truth about my writing. And so people like your mom or your best friend, usually they lie and they say, oh, that's wonderful. But as a writer, I know I want to hear that, but it doesn't do me any good to hear that, because I need to know what needs to get better. And so my wife will tell me the truth. And I've learned not to give her every single draft when I'm excited. I used to do that, and she finally said, I can't tell the difference between these different drafts. Just give it to me when you think it's done. And so anyway, that helps me get through it. But I still struggle to be a disciplined writer. Yeah.
You said in class that you try to write without robbing from your family. So how do you recommend people do that? I mean, I guess it's a personal journey, but how did you do that?
So, yeah, so her question is, I mentioned in a class that I tried not to rob from my family to write. So when I had young kids at home, and when you come home from work, they had things to do, and I also had church callings that had plenty of things to do. So in Hawaii, I got up at 4, and I wrote from 4 to 5, and then at 5, my neighbor, who was a crazy runner, and I would go run, which was a fun thing to do in Hawaii, but it was hard for me to keep up with him. So that I knew, guaranteed, there are no conflicts at 4 in the morning, I can promise you that. And so I felt I could sacrifice my sleep instead of sacrificing my family. That was a choice at that time of my life. And so I've learned, now that I'm so old, that those moments, that moves as life circumstances change, the time to write, it moves around to something that might be more convenient. Or now I just physically couldn't do it at 4 in the morning. I wouldn't be able to see straight. So it wouldn't be very productive to write at 4. You had a question, yeah?
Yeah, I did. So you mentioned that it's a tricky balance. How much more do you research? How do you navigate that between starting writing or doing more research, digging further?
I tried, because I hate first drafts, I rarely have the problem with not having enough research. And so I always have way more than I know that I'll ever use. But I feel like it does help me really have a sense of the whole context as much as possible. There are some things I'll put on mark and think I need to come back. I may need to know more about this later, but I know I'm not going to need that kind of detail now. And then I just start writing. And when I hit a spot where I realize I need to know, I don't know this historical stuff that I need here, I'll keep writing through that chapter and then go back and find out what I need to know. So then I can come back to that chapter and add that historical context that I had missed somehow. But sometimes until you write, you don't really know the details that are going to be necessary to complete the writing. Thanks for asking. Yeah.
Curious about your current or next project.
So am I. So there's a book I've worked on for probably almost 20 years, on and off, a historical novel. It's based on a kid named William Mariner, which is a great name for the story, who was at 14 signed on a privateer in England in 1804, and has lots of adventures. But he ended up in Tonga, and there was a massacre. The ship was slaughtered, the crew was slaughtered, the ship was burned, and the king adopted him. He was 15 by then. And so here's a kid 10,000 miles from home, with cannibals. And so it's a remarkable story. And he wrote an account of that it was more about the anthropology of the Tongans and their language and music. But in Tonga, he's famous because they were pre-literate when he arrived. And he introduced this concept of reading and writing to the king, who had he thought it was magic. They didn't even have symbols. So the idea of representing something with symbols was beyond them. So he wrote the first Tongan dictionary, the first Tongan history, because Tongans couldn't write. And so they don't see him as a colonizer. Tongans see him as one of their own, which makes him really interesting to me. So I've written it as a nonfiction book and as a historical novel, and I still haven't gotten it right. So someday I hope to get that right. But I want to do, I'd like to do a sequel, a couple, not exactly sequels, but follow-up books, so one in 69 and one in 70, maybe with even different characters. And I'm not sure the format, but I have faith that I'll find the way to write those.